Psychologists of Reddit, have you ever been genuinely scared by a patient before? What's your story? Saw a new client for our first session at my home practice. We seemed to click and work together fine. He said he wanted to work through some trauma he'd experienced when he was physically attacked by a previous psychologist. Hearing about terrible psychologists always riles me up, so I was immediately on his side. When I talked with my supervisor about the case a week later, she asked me his full name, which never happens, so I was weirded out immediately. She googled the name then and there and wordlessly handed me her iPad. It was full of news articles about this client and his attacks on psychologists in my local area. I obviously did not see him again, but I was nervous for ages because he knew where I lived. Clinical psychologist here. I used to work in a prison and did a parole evaluation for an inmate that was a high-ranking gang member in a national gang. By his account, he was the highest ranking in the state. In fact, he was placed in that prison to hold his people accountable and keep the peace. He had a long violent record and was, in my opinion, a genuine psychopath. Part of the Evil is discussing the crime and assessing remorse and whatnot. He was so clinical in his description of how he tortured and left this guy to die over an unpaid debt. Live by the sword, die by the sword was his phraseology for the act, like it was nothing. He was also very nonchalant about his ability to take care of his business while inside. I believed him. He had only spent 18 months of his last 15 years outside of prison. My recommendation was not to parole him. There were various factors that I gave, and in the end the parole board went with my recommendation. So the part that actually scared me, this was my first parole level, was this guy's ability to affect the world outside. He could have sent someone to my house if he wanted to. I had no doubt about that. More experienced psychologists told me not to worry about it, that he knew the score and wouldn't take it personally. I had a hard time buying it. I was running a long-term offender group a few months later, and he was part of it. After the first group, I pulled him aside and asked if we were good. He smiled at me and told me not to worry. I did my job and he didn't blame me for writing what I did because it was true. He went on to be a really insightful and active group member. Once when I was a medical student, I was asked to see a patient in the psychiatric unit of the emergency room. I walked in with my short white coat and clipboard and asked the guy what brought him in today and what was wrong. He looked me dead in the eyes with foamy saliva dribbling from the corner of his mouth and a strange smell in the air, and said, "The devil told me to kill you and kill myself." He was sweaty and his eyes were bloodshot and his wiffle beater had dark red/brown stains on it. The door was behind him, and I wasn't sure I could make it there before something bad happened. No idea if he had a weapon on him. Was afraid of calling loudly for help. I was in a quiet corner of the and I felt like I would have had to yell to get attention, and I didn't want to startle him. I stayed there for a half hour and asked him more questions. Slipped out when he started to look sleepy. I'm a therapist, but not a psychologist, if that matters. I used to work in a facility for kids and adolescents with pretty intense behavioral issues. Even when a client was aggressive, I was usually able to de-escalate them, and I generally didn't feel unsafe. In fact, most of the time I was concerned about their safety during outbursts, with one exception. I had a client that was pretty strong and prone to intense tantruming. This client was acting in a way that was unsafe, had a plan to seriously hurt another resident, I think, so I had to put them on restriction within staff eyesight at all times. Their response was to run up to me and attempt to choke me. Luckily the staff got there in time and prevented this kid from seriously hurting me. On another occasion, this same client also took apart their curtain rod in their bedroom and swung it at my head. I dodged in time. Oddly enough, this client and I had a pretty good relationship the other 99% of the time, and I generally enjoyed working with them. When I was studying psychology my final year, I had the opportunity to meet with convicted felons. Essentially, I sat down and spoke to a man in his 30s who was a sexual offender. He told me he used to marry women and then rape their young daughters. Each was in the range of 6 to 7 years old. I listened to him explain it. It was literally my instructions not to judge them. I had to sign a waiver to not get emotional. So I asked him about the home life of those he abused. He'd say that some of the women he married had other children, And in one case there was an older sister who was 13, but he would never ever touch her. He'd drop her off at school, where he told me he was never into any of the children he saw, and take her to practice in friend's house, and while she was gone, he'd go back and rape her 6-year-old sister. He told me that it really isn't always about being attracted to prepubescent girls, it's about the dominance and power that come with having sex with them. He's being rehabilitated now though. Weird part was that I wasn't sure if he was acting remorseful, BC if he was. He is amazing at it. He was just very open to my questions and expressed regret, and I almost believed him. However, when I met a man who was convicted of child pronoun, his I feel terrible-s were transparent and so full of shoot it was disgusting. My professors warned me about manipulation, so that was easy to catch on to, but with the previous guy, he was either an impeccable liar and manipulator, or he genuinely wanted to get better. Crazy. Edit. Grammar mistake / clarity. A few people had unpredictable anger and outbursts that could be scary at times, and once a husband brought a gun to a couple's therapy session and threatened to kill himself / wife. Luckily we were able to calm the situation down, but things like that can end badly, and you always have to be aware of that possibility when emotions run high. A very sweet, mostly blind teenager who was going through his first psychotic break and had a love of martial arts taekwondo, if I remember correctly, was really good at it. He couldn't see and would practice kicks, and at one point accidentally kicked one of the reinforced shatterproof windows in the quiet room. Think padded room without the padding. Turns out they were shatter resistant. He destroyed it with that kick. Why those particular details? Because he would practice his kicks everywhere, was mostly blind, and the one time he flipped up to practice one, and I was walking around the corner, it came literal centimeters from my face, and I felt the impact of it against the air, like a physical force bashing into my face. Sweetest kid in the world. He would have been horrified if it had connected, because things would have broke a lot of things. He also grabbed my arm once in a suddenly firm grasp and asked if I wanted to do taekwondo with him. No I did not. Therapist in training in my tutor, who is a childhood abuse and trauma specialist, tells some horror stories. The one that stood out for this question was a guy in his mid-40s who had lived most of his life with extreme paranoia that his parents were sending people to get information from him to blackmail him with. This guy was extremely unstable and was legally obligated to go to therapy after committing some petty theft because he believed his parents were tracking his money. Anyway, he'd been going for about 6 weeks and he began to talk about a plan for the future. He was kind of vague, but said he had worked out a way to break free from his childhood and move forward. My tutor was apprehensive but hopeful. He had been making good progress in the previous sessions. Fast forward a week and this guy is back again. He's noticeably agitated and carrying a large sports bag. My tutor remarks that she's pleased to see him and likes his new bag. He breaks down. He confesses that he has a machete in the bag and had planned to kill everyone from his old life, starting with his therapist, so he could be free from his past, but she was very nice and would be hard to kill. My tutor politely excused herself and called the police. The guy was very compliant. He'd pretty much given up at that point, but the police confirmed he did indeed have a large machete in his bag and his car was full of beanbags. She said that was the only time she felt she was close to dying, and says the moral of the story is to treat all your clients well, because you never know who's plotting your murder. A 9-year-old I used to teach in lockdown special education mistook my assistant's move towards me as aggressive and attempted to kill her with a desk. I wasn't scared for myself, definitely scared for both the boy, real sweetheart who just got triggered, and the assistant, total beach to me and the kids. Everything turned out okay. I hurried the boy off to his therapist and the assistant quit immediately, and we went back to a normalish classroom. Clinical psychologist in training here. I've never been afraid, but my friend had a client once who made her extremely uncomfortable. Without revealing any information that could break confidentiality, I will say that he had issues with masturbating too much and not doing much else, and at one point asked my friend if they could watch Pronoun together in the next session so he could show her what he does. At another time, he talked about his masturbation habits while touching his dick through his pants a bit. Totally inappropriate behavior. Obviously, this client had lots of other issues, but when these things came up, her supervisor took her off the case because it wasn't suitable for training, and my friend didn't feel safe. Not a psych, but my dad is a retired forensic one. Has got far too many stories, but his first ever murder case decades ago as a noob was a rough one. It involved a guy who kept asking this girl out. She made it clear numerous times that she wasn't interested, but the guy wasn't having it and just kept harassing her. Finally, one day he followed her home where he stabbed her parents and the family dog to death. I don't really want to hear about any of his other cases. Not me, but a friend who is a patient has what's described as treatment-resistant psychosis. She's not a scary person at all. In fact, she's really sweet and caring. But she hears voices that tell her that her parents and little brother will be raped and tortured if she doesn't follow what they say. Sometimes the voices convince her that staff members at the psychiatric intensive care unit she's on are working for the government and trying to run experiments on her and put bugs under her skin. So her voices will tell her to attack staff members. Not super often, but it happens. Whenever it does, she feels terrible afterwards and will cry for hours on end and beg for forgiveness. One of her voices also makes her do her ritual, in which she strips down completely naked and sometimes eats her own shoot. She herself is not a scary person. Psychosis itself is such a scary and heartbreaking illness because she's not a violent person and has tons of compassion and empathy for others. Psychotic does not equal psycho or sociopath. Not a psychologist, but saw a breakdown in my ex that scared me senseless. He had just started meds and the meds reacted horribly with him for whatever reason. He mostly had hallucinations, but sometimes he'd black out and do activities and not remember them. He would call me screaming at 3 AM and he didn't remember a second of it. Any of it. He had hallucinations before, but they got increasingly dangerous with these meds. In particular, I think of one instance. While on the phone during an episode, he said, "I boiled some water." I asked why, as it was 3 AM, and he replied eerily calmly, "They told me I have to stick my hand in here." It was absolutely terrifying. I finally begged him to go to the hospital that following morning to ask for a medication change, and he begrudgingly obliged. While he was there, he started throwing up blood and had to get his stomach pumped. Turns out, in one of his blackouts, he swallowed his entire bottle of medication. My brother-in-law is low-functioning autistic and blind. At one point his care provider, who had worked with him for years and knew him quite well, got into a very dangerous situation with him. She had worked with him since he was smaller and had become experienced at interacting safely when he would become angry and aggressive. They had found a good balance of medication for him and she let her guard down. This time though, he was now 20 years old and 6 foot tall. In a split second, he attacked her, jumping up from the couch directly across from her chair. He was very strong and viciously aggressive. I have found myself in tough situations with him, and I'm 6'4", 225 lbs. After receiving quite a few blows from his hands, hair torn out, and bites on her arms and hands, she was able to push away across the ground and get behind the couch he had been sitting on. She quickly slid the couch into a corner so that he wouldn't have a way around it easily, and she hid herself behind it and tried to be very quiet. He searched that corner of the room for over an hour, following the front and side edges of the couch with his hands, back and forth pacing, until he eventually lost interest and went to play with some toys off in the corner of the room. She got out of the corner and ran for her door, just as her assistant was coming to remind her that she had gone over the allotted time. My Bill is an amazing guy and I've had some awesome experiences with him over the years, but the idea of being hunted by sound like that is pretty freaky. Had a client years ago who had recently gotten out of prison for assaulting a police officer pretty badly. The client had a volatile temper and lived in a violent family growing up. The client never got angry with me, personally. However, while talking about their family and other people in their life, the client would get so worked up with anger that I sometimes wondered if I was safe. I started pretending to be on emergency call duty in the clinic where I worked, so that I had an excuse to carry a walkie-talkie with me during our sessions. Shortly after I began doing that, I terminated the therapeutic relationship and referred the client for a completely different type of treatment than what I'd provided. The last I heard, the new treatment method was helping the client. Not a psychologist, but I work at a psych hospital. Your first experience with a patient attempting to seriously injure or kill you is always frightening, but most of the time, at least at my workplace, it's more heartbreaking than scary. I'm not a psychologist, but I have 2 psych degrees and have been in and out of psychiatric wards since my late teens. For 14 years I worked with adults with developmental disabilities. So, as you can imagine, I've seen my fair share of frightening behavior. But nothing scared me more than nannying for a 5-year-old boy with autism and a mood disorder. He had just been released from the hospital, where he had stayed for a month, to get acclimated to behavioral meds, but in the short 2 weeks I nannied for him, I feared for my life. He would kick, bite, scratch, hit, spit, come after me with knives, punch cars, scream loud enough for neighbors to think he was being abused, and destroyed his mother's picture-perfect apartment. And when I tried to tell his mom that he needed more help than a babysitter could give him, she fired me saying I was wrong, and that he just needs someone more attentive. Complete denial. Oh man, once I was psychotic bipolar in hospital, and imagined my parents and little brother were there, and I thought they came up an escalator into the hospital, not real, and my dad was about to be beaten up by these guys. I attacked the nurse trying to get to them, pushed her over, tried to pull out my catheter, and ran around looking to save my dad with nurses trying to hold me down. I feel absolutely horrid looking back, because I really hurt that nurse, and by the time I came to and wanted to apologize, her shift had long ended, and I never saw her again to say sorry. Obligatory. Not a psychologist, but I used to work as an aide in a special education classroom in a middle school. The year I started, a majority of my workload was 8th grade boys, and 2 of them had deeply troubling behavioral issues. One kid assaulted a girl in his class. At school, in front, is a bunch of other kids. He actually got arrested for it, but the school couldn't expel him because of his disability. For the rest of the year, he was forbidden from being anywhere, including the lunchroom with her. I spent a lot of time essentially babysitting this kid, and because he didn't give a frick about school, he did practically nothing during his time in the resource room. The last I heard, he'd been arrested again for breaking into someone's house and stealing a handgun. But the one who scared me was completely antisocial, to the point of threatening to hurt himself or others when a field trip or school assembly was coming up. We eventually had to tell his parents in advance so they wouldn't bring him to school. He talked about death constantly, all while extremely medicated, so it was a very muted, mumbled, and unthrough 1,000-yard stare with spittle coming from his mouth. One of the teachers was pregnant. She wasn't his teacher, but he knew who she was, and one day he asked me, would Mrs. X's baby live if someone ran her over in a car? I told him I didn't know and tried to change the subject. Then he asked, what if someone cut her stomach open? What if they stabbed her? What if she had been dead for a while and no one found her? This really freaked me out, and I had to report it to the SPED teacher. When I told her, she said he had asked her and other students the same thing and scared the shoot out of them. She said the pregnant teacher had been advised to avoid him in case he did or said anything to upset her. Was a drug and alcohol counselor for a while, not a psychologist. Had a client who I didn't make good progress with, and there was always something off. I sometimes ran into him at a local bar where he wasn't supposed to be. He was a court-ordered referral, and staying out of places like that was part of his treatment plan. I say this because it meant he learned one of the places where I socialized sometimes. Anyway, stories he told me about weekends when he traveled away from that small town often hinted at raping. He'd say things about how she said she didn't like me, but she was really just joking and flirting. Anyway, I found a way to control her, so she wanted him. Hehe. I wasn't able to pull enough detail to be positive or to gather any actual identifying information, such as exactly where he'd traveled to or what the girl's name was, but this happened several times. He was vague enough to be both scary and beyond reach. Eventually, he was moving away from the area, and at his last appointment with me, he hinted that we could throw down, and he would get his money's worth out of it. I watched over my shoulder until I was certain he was moved for good. Not a psych, but I briefly worked at an inpatient psych hospital, and during my training a support code was called because a woman who'd had abdominal surgery had ripped open the wound and stitches and was saying over and over, "I can die now, I can die now," as she reached inside of her wound. I lasted only a month, but never felt fear like I did there.